So welcome all. I can see we have around 50 odd attendees joined us this evening, and we're expecting over 100, so I expect more to join in the next few minutes. My name's Chris Bayliss. I'm the Director of Standards with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and I am jointly hosting this webinar with my colleague Cameron Jones, Director of Assurance with the ASI. We're going to be talking today about the standards revision process, but specifically this final public consultation round, which began last week and is running for the next 30 days or so. Today, we want this to be a really interactive session, so we're really keen to get your feedback and hear your questions. So I do encourage you to use the Q&A box, which you'll find on your screen, part of this platform. Share your questions with us, and we'll address them as we go through the presentation. Probably about 15-20 minutes in the presentation, and then in a question and answer session at the end, or for the majority of this discussion. So please feel free to use the Q&A box. There is a chat box as well. I'd encourage you to use the Q&A, please, if you can. That makes our lives easier in sorting through the questions. So welcome from me, Chris, and maybe I'll hand over to my colleague Cameron to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good to join you today. And hi, everybody. We've just got a few formalities to get through, as we do with each and every meeting that we hold with the ASI. And I draw your attention, everybody, to our antitrust compliance policy. So attendees are kindly reminded that ASI is committed to complying with all relevant antitrust and competition laws and regulations, and to that end has adopted a competition policy compliance with, which is a condition of ASI participation. Failure to abide by these laws can have extremely serious consequences for ASI and its participants, including heavy fines. So today, you're therefore asked to have due regard to this policy and in respect of all other ASI activities that you participate in. And also, as we do in each and every ASI meeting, we acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to their traditional lands where we and our members operate. We aim to respect cultural heritage, customs and beliefs of all Indigenous people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And myself, being in the Australian Capital Territory, I pay specific respect to the Ngunnawal people as I stand on their lands today. Now, apologies, everybody. We seem to be having a little bit of lag with the animation of the slides. I think it's just due to the sheer number of participants on this platform, but bear with us on that front. Look, here's the agenda for today. We're going to give you an update on the standards revision timeline and the overall expected release date of the standards and accompanying documentation. Then we'll move on to a general overview on the key updates. So not all updates, but the key updates on both standards. And then a little bit later on, I will give you an update on the assurance manual and the key changes and updates to that document. Then specifically a short point for you all on how to provide specific feedback to ASI, the mechanisms and logistics for doing so. And then, as Chris mentioned earlier, we'll open up the floor using the Q&A box for questions and answers. Any further information can be obtained on that web link that we've provided down the bottom there, aluminium-stewardship.org/ASI standards revision. I'll pass on to you, Chris, if you don't mind.
Sure. Absolutely, and sorry for the lag in these. Everything seems very clear to me, but I guess I'm the one pressing the buttons, so I'll take my time as I move through these slides. Just a quick recap on the standards revision scope and the documents that we've been working on over the last 2 years, actually. There's existing versions of ASI's performance standard and chain of custody standard with supporting guidance attached. The current performance standard is version 2. The current chain of custody standard is version 1. So you'll see as we go through the documents later on, there'll be reference to those 2017 versions and the changes that are proposed to those versions, so that on release, we can expect to see the performance standard version 3 and chain of custody standard version 2. Supporting documents, non-normative documents, are the performance standard guidance and chain of custody standard guidance, which are updated at the moment at the same time. And if we have a bit of time left at the end of today, maybe we'll talk a bit about how we're looking to update the guidance more regularly or more regularly in the future post-revision. So if we get a bit of time today, we'll talk a bit about how that guidance can adapt to a really fast-moving sustainability discussion, particularly around biodiversity, greenhouse gases. Other supporting documentation for assurance, the assurance manual is also under revision. Cam will talk about that today. Our claims guide is also part of that suite of documentation. And finally, a glossary. And the glossary is really, glossary is new actually. It's the first time we'll publish that post-revision. And that's an opportunity for us to standardize terms throughout all of the standards and all of the guidance and supporting documentation. So I think a theme, or I hope a theme of the revisions that we're undergoing at the moment is one of improving clarity and removing redundancy. So a lot of what we're talking about today is related to the normative documents, criteria changes, but actually there's a significant amount of work in updating guidance and non-normative text as well, and that's to improve that clarity and to remove redundancy. This process, this revision process, is part of our commitment under the ICL Alliance, of which we're a code compliant member, which has codes for standard setting. We're in today assurance and impacts. So yes, that's the scope today. All of those documents are online and are a part of this feedback process. In terms of timeline, where do we start? Well, it was actually back at the beginning of 2020. So we're now into essentially year 3 of this standards revision process. and the time is almost nigh to publish, right? We have extended this period. COVID, of course, impacted this to a given extent. And so we've actually extended this revision period into 2022. With an eye to have the standards adopted by the board, formally adopted by the ASI board at the end of April 2022, with publication of the documents in multiple languages in May of 2022, and maybe slightly later for some languages into June, into Q3 of 2022. But what this says to you now, I hope, is that we are at the end of this process. This second consultation period is a final consultation period in this revision process. Had a couple of years, lots of opportunity for input, both externally, but also from within our multi-stakeholder groups and our standards committee. I actually see a question from Dieter that's just come in about translation into German. Dieter, we will be translating final documents into German. We don't translate the drafts into German. They're produced at the moment in English, Chinese, and French, but you will see a final version of all the documents, normative and non-normative, post-adoption. And our plan at the moment is that that would happen in kind of June, July period this year. As you can imagine, we have to wait till quite late in the day to translate. With all of these ongoing changes and this dynamic situation, translation is quite an intense period. We've just been through one on the last draft, so that's why there's going to be a slight delay, month or two, before we have all languages live. So German will be available, I would expect, June, July this year. Thank you, Dieter. Quick message on this is that post-consultation, you can see this consultation is 30 days, shortened from the last one of 60 days. That was a decision made by the Standards Committee in order for us to realize a final document, within this quite tight time period. But you'll notice that we only really have 8 weeks between the end of consultation and our target adoption date. Time is really short to incorporate feedback. So we're really going to focus in this next post consultation round on normative language. So proposed comments, logged comments on criteria. That's not to say we won't consider language change or comments on the non-normative text, the guidance text, but that can form part of later updates post-adoption. So real tight periods to integrate comments from stakeholders this round. Quick comment on the last period. Sorry, my machine is playing up here, so please bear with me. In the last consultation round held in March, April 2021, we received over 600 logged comments. So 600 comments came in and we had to work through those. I'm hoping we get a similar number this time. I'm keen to get feedback from you, from the public, on these documents. But with that 8-week period, necessarily, we will have to be very focused in our feedback. And do you know what? The feedback that comes in is itself focused. If you do a quick kind of analysis of the feedback that came in our last round through the logged comments, and you weight some of the major issues for the public consultation, you can see in this word cloud that there's a real weighting according to certain criteria. Excuse the language in there, the point instead of the point itself. But you can see that 8.6 dominates. That's biodiversity throughout. Principle 8 seems to dominate this cloud. That's on biodiversity. Principle 5 is another one. That's greenhouse gas emissions. Principle 9.8, that's this alignment with LME and the OECD due diligence for human rights. You can see these big issues being commented on a lot in public consultation. So they really dictate our focus in how we address those comments. This kind of language that's being used in there as well. What I was really surprised about is the dominance of guidance here. Now, I know that criterion standard piece could probably be put together, but people are looking for guidance. They're looking for clarity in implementation. And that seems to have been a theme through this last consultation round, is yes, changes to normative language, to criteria, but really a demand for clarity for implementation, both from entities, certifying entities, and for auditors. Winfried, with the comments focused on the regulatory text, will the guidance documents also be released in an updated version? Yes, the guidance documents will also be released at the same time as the normative language in May 2022. I'll talk maybe if we've got time a bit later on an updated guidance process post-revision, as I say, but you can expect updates to finalized versions of all 7 of those documents that I spoke about earlier on. So I can see I've got a lot of lag on these slides, so I'm going to slow down a little bit. And what we'll do now is go through some of the changes that have been proposed since that last consultation period around those key issues. Then I'll look a little bit about the large-scale changes that one might expect since the last published version, the 2017 version. And I'll do that for the performance standard, and then we'll do it for the chain of custody standard, and then I'll hand over to Cam to discuss the changes to the assurance manual. So, in terms of Principle 5, this is the greenhouse gas emissions related principle. You will have seen, or you will see when you look at the drafts, quite significant revision to that principle, really in terms of ordering, but also in terms of the expectations for members. And I'll talk through these one by one now. This isn't the GHG session, so there's lots to talk about greenhouse gases. I'd encourage you to look at a piece that was written just before Christmas on ASI's position post COP26, and for further information on greenhouse gas emissions, I'm always available to discuss. So under this new proposed principle, there's an expectation that all certifying entities, no matter where they sit on the value chain, are required to establish a greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan that's consistent with a below 1.5 degree warming scenario. Now, a sector-wide 1.5 degree scenario was published by the International Aluminium Institute in November, December last year. So we know the sectoral slope. Now the issue is, how do you translate that into an entity slope? And that methodology does not currently exist, but we are working on a project now to deliver that in 2022. So the criterion itself asks for establishment of reduction plans aligned with that 1.5 degree scenario. As well as that, all entities are required to develop a pathway that includes emissions targets. So it's not enough just to know the slope. You need to be disclosing intermediate targets to reach that end state, and also plans for how you're going to do it. Changing procurement practices, implementation of renewable energy, etc. All entities are required to publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions reduction performance, and disclosure of that GHG data must be independently verified prior to publication. Winfried, I'll address your answer back in the Q&A session on SMEs and how they handle that. Emissions intensity threshold, which was a big number from before. You'll remember this 8 tons per ton for smelters. That's scope 1 and 2. We've expanded that to now include scope 3, categories 1, 3, and 4. That means essentially cradle to gate for smelters, alumina refining included, the bauxite included, the transportation included, with a threshold value of 11 for primary metals. So that threshold value has been expanded to incorporate all upstream emissions for smelters. There's some further text on that, but we can get into that in Q&A, I think. Second piece on emissions, effluents, and waste, principle 6. Within the last, or prior to the last consultation, there was the proposal to include the reporting of waste data to ASI, a new criterion 6.9. That's actually been removed. The requirement for reporting of data to ASI no longer sits within this draft. What has been included is the revision of emissions and discharges criteria to include area of influence. You may remember from the last round, this area of influence inclusion in a number of criteria. We've expanded that now to also include emissions, effluents, and waste. On the social part of the performance standard, principles 9 to 11, we've seen expansion of reference to free, prior, and informed consent to the resettlement criterion, so beyond the other principle 9 criteria. We've seen expanded and revised criterion on disciplinary practices, criterion 10.6, and a quite major change under criterion 11, which is alignment of occupational health and safety management systems with the requirements of ISO 45001. So that's not to say you need to be ISO 45001 certified to be compliant, but you need to align with the requirements of 45001 under the various criteria. That goes beyond just having the policy, which was the previous criteria. They're the major changes, I guess, since the last consultation. What does that mean in terms of revision to the 2017 document? So incorporating some of the revisions that happened prior to this consultation period. Well, biodiversity ecosystem services, this principle 8, there's major changes there. This inclusion of ecosystem services, risk impact assessment and management. There's been no change in this, no major change in this period to that normative language, although the guidance has significantly changed. And a new requirement on protected areas, that's criterion 8.6. Under governance, expanded requirements for environmental, social, and human rights impact assessments, criteria 2.5 and 2.6, and a new requirements for suspended operations. We didn't receive significant comment on that in the last public consultation, so I expect that will remain into the final document. Free, prior, informed consent, the addition of a new sub-criterion from bauxite mining flows over from the last consultation period. All new phases of bauxite mining operations and any alterations to existing mine rehab or closure plans need free, prior, and informed consent. I think we can expect to see some significant work on free, prior, and informed consent, even post-revision. So I think this is going to be one of the areas for focus on guidance update, even after we have published in May. Conflict-afflicted high-risk areas, alignment with the LME responsible sourcing requirements, criterion 9.8, you may remember significant change in that, and some quite tight language in order for us to align fully with those responsible sourcing requirements. Now, that LME alignment process is still ongoing. You may well see some changes to the guidance accordingly. But since the last consultation period, not significant change to the normative language. Finally, on the cross-cutting issues, you'll find these throughout the document, increasing focus on public disclosure of data throughout all of the criteria. Sub-criteria on effective monitoring of plans, policies, and systems that incorporate regular review and improvement. Consultation throughout, consultation with affected parties and organizations, affected populations and organizations. You may remember this was a new term. It's been incorporated into the glossary that goes beyond, or that defines clearly what, who they are. And so consultation with those groups forms part of that cross-cutting process. Anonymous attendee, thank you for your question on FPIC. FPIC is not only applicable to mining operations or throughout the supply chain. 9.4 broadly is applicable to all entities to identify impacted indigenous communities and to conduct FPIC accordingly. But 9.4b specifically says for bauxite mining, whether or not you identify or go through that process, that FPIC applies to you. So it's a real focus on the high risk areas of bauxite mining. So no, FPIC is not only applicable to mining operations, it is throughout the supply chain where indigenous peoples have been identified. Winfried, 2.5, 2.6, nothing is, there is nothing new since the last consultation period. So I'm happy to talk through some of that language. I'll have to pull that up at the end. We can do that, but there's been no change since the last draft. This is a change since 2017. Ecosystem services is in the glossary. Ecosystem services is a focus on the services that natural systems bring. So it's not just about biodiversity. It is about the services that biodiversity and that ecosystem offers to populations, local communities, local economies. So it's, I don't know if I will also encourage people to go and look at our revised strategy, which focuses on that kind of nature positive approach, where the economy, social systems are actually underpinned by biodiverse ecosystems. So they're not just there outside of our gates, they are also supporting industry, they're supporting local communities as well. But do take a look at ecosystem services, it is well defined. In terms of chain of custody, I have to admit that we have not received a huge number of comments on chain of custody through the consultation process, but we have made some significant changes nonetheless. And this is in response, I guess, to feedback of certifying entities who have found it challenging to negotiate the complexities of chain of custody, particularly around material accounting systems. So since the last consultation, you will see significant changes, particularly in the guidance. It really is about that clarity, removing redundancy and improving logic. So in terms of logic and language, we have clarity on the application of criteria to specific supply chain activities. So when does eligible scrap apply? Well, eligible scrap only really applies when you're in part of a refining, remelting process. So that's all been clarified, and actually there's some, I hope, some helpful diagrams within the guidance that support that. I can show those today, but we may be running out of time. There's also training going to be available on that too. So one of the things we have been asked for is increased training. We'll see some training resources published later this year. We've simplified the COC material types. We removed the differentiation of cold and liquid metal, which are sub-types of ASI aluminium, but really they complicate matters. So ASI aluminium is ASI aluminium, whatever form it's in, cold, liquid, it doesn't matter. We've specified process inflows and outflows. As I said before, there's eligible scrap flow specifically into certain processes. And we've improved the consistency in language and defined terms throughout. We use the language input, output only for COC material crossing a certification scope boundary. Our entities are different shapes and sizes, they have different activities within their scope, and so we have to be very clear that we're talking about certain inputs to that system, which are ASI or COC material. So when other material crosses that boundary, non-ASI for instance, that's seen as an inflow. I'll talk a bit about that more later on, but that's, you'll see, I hope, a logic to that and improved clarity, especially in the guidance. On the material flow and mass balance, revised data reporting requirements under 1.7, we've actually just undertaken a test of that system with new requirements with a subset of entities. That was concluded by my colleague Claudia Michalska just before the Christmas break. We've had some good feedback on that, and we can expect to incorporate that feedback into the next round as well. We've removed reference to recyclable scrap material accounting, and we've simplified material accounting systems so that we can focus on this range of COC materials and not just be specific about certain flows. So we want material accounting systems that account for material in whatever form in order to be compliant, not necessarily a hard focus on, let's say, specifically ASI aluminium. We've removed the reference to internal scrap remelting throughout. Because internal scrap never leaves the certification scope, because it never crosses the boundary, it's actually irrelevant in a mass balance system, so it doesn't have a place in the COC, which is based on mass balance. Under material accounting systems, the system itself, as I was saying before, is about this safeguarding of the integrity of material rather than a specific measurement of inputs. We still need that input-output data. That's part of 1.7, but you need a system that can cope with that. So they're the major changes. I would encourage people to have a look at that, and also if they have any questions, do come to me too. It's a complex subject, and we have listened to and heard the concerns or the questions from implementing entities about that complexity. But it is a complex subject. Since the last standard, these were issues that were already raised and dealt with post in the last consultation period. We are now able to, COC material and eligible scrap can now be sourced through a trader. It can flow through traders. I think that was positively received in the last consultation round with due diligence. Market credit system has been removed. There's no feedback that would suggest we should add that back in. Pre-consumer scrap, that is part of a closed loop system. So pre-consumer scrap that leaves a certified entity goes to a non-certified entity, and then scrap which returns immediately back to the certified entity, that is now eligible scrap, can be seen as eligible scrap with due diligence under 4.2. Oh, what's my machine is playing up. And finally, on the COC documentation, sustainability data, which is optional, we have asked for optional reporting of cradle to gate carbon footprint of COC material. Do you know what? This is a big one for me. I think this is coming for all, this understanding of the true carbon footprint cradle to gate of received material, and then ongoing communication of that number to your customers to allow a true life cycle impact of consumed material. We see it being articulated through the CBAM in Europe, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We see it being asked for by customers. So it's optional now, but watch this space, because I think that's going to be something that's going to be hardened in the future. And then finally, recycled content, including methodologies. That was in the last version. We have not seen changes in this round. So with that, that's the broad changes to COC and performance standard. I'm looking at the clock, and with time limited, I'm going to hand over to Cam now, and then we'll come back for Q&A. So please, Cam.
Thanks, Chris. And I shouldn't take too much of your time in this session now, everybody, but I just wanted to spend, say, 5 minutes going through the key updates to the assurance manual. It is a big document, as most of you, if not all of you, are aware, and it still remains a big document. But look, essentially, it's a large guidance document. And because of that, a lot of the changes to the assurance manual are actually improvements around clarity and the guidance. So there aren't an enormous amount of new, fresh requirements to the assurance manual. A lot of it is And actually, I think we need to step a slide back, actually, Chris, if you don't mind, back one, there we go. And as I've just said there, majority of the updates to the assurance manual from the current version 1 to version 2 relate to improved guidance and direction. And there's just a few there below that I'd just like to briefly draw your attention to. So it's the outsourcing of auditing contractors, just a little bit more information provided or clarity provided there. That always was in there, but it wasn't overly clear in terms of accountability for the managing audit firm. A risk-based approach to auditing, it's always been there, but we've just reinforced that a bit further with some more discussion in the assurance manual on that. Maturity ratings. Now, the Standards Committee, we discussed maturity ratings and their applicability and also their assessment as well in great detail, more so in 2020. So we've provided some more clarification around how those maturity ratings are to be assessed, how they're to be used with respect to defining what the next audit type would be and how many audits were. And also, we actually are now going to include the final total maturity rating in the public reports moving on. A little bit more clarity throughout the assurance manual around applicable law and the ASI standards. What to do with corrective action plans. Again, they've always been a requirement for major non-conformances, but we've just provided a little bit more concrete logistics and methodology about how those are to be addressed by member, auditor and the secretariat. Again, clarification around the COC certification is possible without yet receiving COC material. A little bit more information around how to effectively resource an audit and get your audit teams right, how to engage your stakeholders sufficiently on site, the various types of reports and what they're used for, a little bit more clarity for auditors around the oversight process, what we look for as a secretariat during the oversight process, how long things will take to turn around, the types of questions we'll ask, the types of issues we'll look at. A little bit more around divestments and acquisitions. There's been a few cases in the last 12 months around divestment and acquisitions. What happens to audit reports, certificates, what happens to membership, how that transfers, should you divest or acquire an ASI certified site. So there's more guidance around that. And again, more guidance around multi-site auditing approaches and just providing both members and auditors a little bit more flexibility when you've got multi-site audits occurring. Next slide, thanks. The new or enhanced requirements, again, I've got in parentheses then, but not limited to. There are a few more, but these are the key ones I just wanted to run past you too. Transition from the material stewardship certification that some members do have, where they're only looking at Principle 4 at the moment, and their certification only relates to the criteria in Principle 4. There'll be a transition period of new and also existing certifications to this point to look at Principles 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then over a certification cycle, i.e. 3 years, to transition to the full standard. Again, it was a topic that was discussed at length by the Standards Committee and also was referred to by a number of comments in the log. And we thought rather than going straight from Principle 4 to the entire standard, there'd be a transition to allow entities and members to adjust over a 3-year period. So that's discussed in detail with a significant table in the assurance manual on how that applies to members. Gender-based auditing approaches and referencing the number of women workers. Now, gender-based auditing also is being addressed at the moment through our training program as well. So that shouldn't be a new requirement at the moment for our auditors, but that's already been in place. A big one here too is actually the limit. There is a limit now of 3 major non-conformances for certification, which will give you a provisional certification. At the moment, technically, there is no limit, but that's one of the big changes. It will be limited to 3. You have 4 major non-conformances, certification is not achieved, not achievable. The annual reporting requirements, most members, or some members now are reporting to us, their COC and waste data, but we've incorporated that into the manual. A force majeure optionality or option. Now, a number of members are using that with this thing called COVID-19 we're all aware of. We've made reference to that as an ongoing option should that be required. Another big component is this pre-audit assessment by the ASI Secretariat of audit plans for certain audit types. This is a new one. It's been communicated to members and auditors recently, mainly for the upstream, so bauxite, refining and smelting, initial certification audits for the performance standard only. So it's only those audit types we wish to have a look at the audit plans and schedules at least 6 weeks before that audit goes ahead. Again, a little bit more around the maturity ratings, a little bit more requirements around mandatory interviews with Indigenous peoples and affected communities where they actually are identified. A little bit more around remote interview techniques, which are becoming a bit more applicable these days. We specify the issue around confidentiality of information obtained by auditors during audits. And again, wasn't specified, has been implied, but within 4 months of an audit completed, the audit has to be submitted to ASI. Otherwise, it gets a little stale. The findings are a little bit old, so therefore the audit may have to be redone. So we've just specified that as well in the assurance manual. So that's the far majority of changes and updates to the assurance manual. There are a few more, but I stress the need. It is a long document, but I'd love you all to have a flick through it. But again, the last 2 slides here provide the majority of the changes to the assurance process and the assurance manual. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Cam. There's some questions actually come in real time on the assurance process, and I wonder if we go to those straight away while things are top of the mind. If you're happy with that, I think we're into Q&A now anyway. We can talk about feedback a bit later on. One of those questions that has come in is from Steve Bater, asking when will the existing certified entities be assessed against version 3, and how long do entities thus have to make necessary changes to their organisation?
So I guess that there's 2 answers to that, or 2 scenarios. One is if you're an existing certified member, it relates very much so to your certification cycle. So if your certification matures, or your current certification expires later than, let's say, June 2023, you'll have to shift across to version 3, the performance standard, version 2 of the COC standard. If your certification cycle finishes prior to June 2023, there's the option of sticking with V2. But again, then you've got that certification period, and then there's no choice. You'll have to switch across to version 3. There is the option mid-term, if I use that phrase, mid-certification cycle, of using a surveillance audit to step up from version 2 to version 3. If you are mid-cycle and you want to step up, a number of members have mentioned that as an option to us already, and we've said that sounds good. They're just testing the waters, as it were. We're on version 2. Our version 2 recertification will be happening in this 12-month transitional period. We're not quite ready, but we'd love to be at version 3 soon. So there's the option of going from V2 to V3, mid-cycle with a surveillance or scope change audit. That's an option. It's not exactly black and white on those fronts. And then if you're a new member, again, it comes down to when you became a member. And then looking at that 2-year period for you to get at least one operation certified to the performance standard. So it comes back to that. So if you're a member signing up tomorrow, then depending on when you get certified, if you're an early adopter, you may be able to squeeze in with version 2, very unlikely. But in all honesty, you'd probably have to go to version 3. So there's a little bit case by case on that front, but it very much depends on your certification cycle and whether you're a new member that's not certified yet.
Thank you. And so maybe following on from that, and I guess this is a question that we've actually been wrestling with in the Secretariat a little bit recently from Winfried, which is the transition period for the non-normative documents. He's specified here the applicability of the assurance manual. Is there a transition period there, or do you have 2 concurrent documents, or does one take over the other?
Yeah, no, good question. And following on from a discussion that both you and I had, Chris, recently about the new assurance manual, and I guess I've alluded to that in what I've just said recently, is that a lot of the assurance manual is guidance and for auditors. So there's little reason why the new assurance manual, when it is released in June 22 or May if we're lucky, that the auditors and the members can't leverage off that as well with some greater requirements. As I said, the slide that's up on our screens at the moment, they're the new requirements, so that there aren't many. But to go back and answer the question more directly, there is synergy or compatibility between the new assurance manual and the new standard. So that's where they're linked. So those hard and fast requirements, and look, I take the point here, this limit of 3 major NCs, that won't kick in fully until June 23. So there is that 12-month familiarisation or transitional period. We're not going to go cold and fast on June 1, 2022. So again, it's not a black and white answer here. The two documents can be used concurrently. I urge members and auditors to look at the newer version because it's a better version. It's gone through a lot of iterations, comments, and reviews. But the requirements you can fall back on version 2 if you're with the old or current standards.
And so I like this is, this is not black and white for guidance, absolutely agree. And there's more black and white for the normative documents. That's how it should be. It goes back to Winfried's question, I think earlier on, about this interpretation of the assurance manual, not as additional. So we are looking, I think, to be much clearer that normative language, the standards themselves, yes, that's black and white, right? You can see it written down there. That's not going to change in the next 3 to 5 years. But the guidance is evolving, it is changing, it is adapting according to our certification system, but also the outside world as well. So people need to be ready for the fact that as we are clearer that guidance is guidance and criteria are normative, the guidance documents will become less black and white, and I think personally will need to be tailored to specific audiences. Guidance for entities is not the same as guidance for auditors. They have different purposes, right? So Winfried, that ensuring that auditors don't interpret assurance manual as additional, I hope is coming through as we are much clearer on criterion, and as we're clearer as well that guidance truly is guidance.
Look, and just further to that, Chris, and to everybody, is I think that's the real strength of our oversight process too, is that the assurance function within the secretariat have very open, pragmatic and honest communication channels open, a 3-way between member, between auditor and ourselves too. So it's not, there is that ability to have that honest discussion about where things are at with respect to the certifications and what's to be applied. A lot of that discussion at the moment is happening pre-audit, particularly around the ability of able to get to site, whether it's a remote audit or what the scope change is going to look like, what new facilities are being added in. That discussion is happening between the secretariat, the auditor and the member weeks before the audit happens. So that also provides the opportunity for us to engage with auditors on this transition period as well, to give them a heads up to go, look, hey, this is the audit, you're going to the new standard, just reminder that we've got these requirements. But on the other hand, we've got the old assurance manual because you're working with the old standard. So there's that option too. It's not going to be, you're not going to have the rope completely cut and having auditors and members sort of sailing off without support.
Good, thank you. The question actually come in on chat. Seung Young Lee about COC auditing and the visiting or potential visiting of outsourcing contractors, which have been kind of clarified under COC. It says not clearly addressed in the revised assurance manual. My personal approach on this is, of course, outsourcing contractors, their very purpose is, the way they're treated is as part of the certification scope. So they essentially become part of the scope of the certifying entity. We understand that they are potentially numerous, and so my understanding is that a sampled approach based on risk is the approach that would be used for the visiting of those. That's not in the assurance manual according to the commenter. Cam, I don't know if that's something that should be included in the assurance manual or if it's taken as read because essentially the outsourcing contractor becomes part of the certification scope of the certifying entity.
We have touched on it, Chris. It is about the risk, and it'd be about setting up the audit plan, the audit schedule. It'd be the auditor's prerogative to say, right, this is what we're auditing as part of our audit scope. If there are any outsourced contractors ideally they should be referenced in the audit scope, and then it's up, because I mean the auditor, he or she can't visit every single thing. You know, there is a fine at a particular time. Again, apply that risk lens as you just touched on, Chris, and then audit accordingly, depending on level of risk and maybe volume of materials, for example.
Thank you. So Young Lee, we are taking notes, but I would encourage you to integrate that into the formalized feedback process. We'll talk a bit about that towards the end of this call. So to get that down in writing, get it to us. If that's something you want to see articulated clearly somewhere, we can act on that. And actually, that's a call to everyone who's on the call today. Thank you very much for the dynamic, lots of questions coming in. This is fantastic. Do encourage you also to participate in that formal feedback process. Get your comments to us. Cam will give you a bit of a break. I'll go back to the...
I just thought I could answer one really quickly.
Sure.
From Nicole here about, and I did touch on it, about audits submitted within 4 months by the auditor. The comment was made actually a very long time. Yeah, one could argue that, but if we look at, we haven't received, I don't think we've received any. There might be one due to an administrative problem and some COVID issues too, but generally we receive audits within 6 weeks. Of being completed. Auditors will be well aware, but there's a lot of work to finalise and tick the boxes and cross 100 T's and dot 1,000 I's to get the report all up and running. So it does take some time. 4 months was a little bit of contingency was built into that time to allow for logistical issues, and also the fact that sometimes auditors are, in a COVID-free world, whenever that will happen, are going sort of from country to country. They're doing one audit, then moving across to another one, and so forth. And often it can take several weeks for them to go back and tidy up reports. So that is one of the reasons we went out to 4 months. 6 months was far too long. 3 months at times might have been pushing a little bit, so we've opted for the 4 months there. But do agree, it is a fairly long time, but we felt it wasn't enough to render any findings to, I use the word stale. So that was to respond to Nicole's comment there.
Great, thank you. A couple of items on process. Dong Chung Ming, consultation period is short. Yes, we have this short time frame to incorporate feedback, but it's just before and after the Chinese New Year holiday. Is it possible to provide feedback in Chinese? Yes, in fact, our feedback forms are in English, French and Chinese, and actually we encourage feedback in any language. You get it to us, we'll translate it and address it. I would say now that we have this deadline of early February for delivery of feedback. That's not to say that we wouldn't consider feedback outside of that period as well. So it's not that the door's shut, and we would encourage a wide range of feedback to us. Having said that, post-consultation, prior to adoption by the board on the 27th of April, time is limited. So I can't guarantee that comments that come in after the consultation period will be addressed in this round, but we would look to incorporate those in future updates to the guidance. I think that links on to a question that's come in from Artem Skripnikov. During the final public consultations, are feedback accepted for all wording of the standards or for only changes since the last consultation? Artem, this comment period is for all of the words in all of the documents, no matter when they were drafted. So comments are welcome on any language, on any part of any of the documents, not just what happened since the last public consultation. But the Standards Committee will not be revisiting discussions that they have already had over the last 2 years. So unless there is a material difference and some evidence of changes, let's say externally, new methodologies, new data available to change a decision that's already been made by the Standards Committee, we won't be revisiting those. Time is short. We've had 2 years of discussions. We will be adopting in April. So comment on all, but we won't be going over old ground. That then links, I think, to a great question that has come in specifically on traceability from Laura Dombey, physical traceability in the mass balance system. Is it part of the discussion currently? Well, I'll tell you now, it's part of the broad discussion within aluminium and all commodities. It is not part of this consultation period discussion. So the COC continues to be a mass balance system. and that's what will go into the final document released in April. But post-revision, there will be opportunity, and I'm keen to start that discussion soon, of what next. What is there beyond mass balance that may be applicable? Is it segment specific? Are there certain closed loop systems that may require traceability? What is the demand from customers and other stakeholders? So yes, it's part of the broad discussion. Yes, it's something that I'd like the Standards Committee and our membership to address, but it will happen post consultation. I can't tell you the outcome of those discussions, just that we're keen to have them post revision. Let me see. So we've got some questions, or we've got a question on GHG methodology. Vicky, you have identified very clearly that this gap in methodology, which makes it very difficult to apply 5.3. We're working with Science Based Targets Initiative, and our hope is to have a method for aluminium sector 1.5 degree aligned methods by the end of 2022. So there will be a gap, there will be that year gap between publication and between that method. But it's a kind of a but, it's a big but. The direction is clear. 1.5 degree slope for the globe sees 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And for the aluminium sector, it sees 95% reduction in total emissions by 2050. It means procurement practices change. It means a change in the energy that we use. It means a complete retooling of our processes. So methodology, yeah, later this year, but the direction, I think, is very clear, and it's well articulated in ASI's commitment to a 1.5 degree aligned future. And that, I think, is well articulated in the criterion, which says that all entities, no matter where they sit on the value chain, will need to have plans to be 1.5 aligned, whether that's through procurement of low carbon products if you're downstream, or if it means changes to your processes or your energy systems for the upstream. So yeah, there's going to be a gap, but
Chris, just on that, we've got a session coming up soon, haven't we? I've been informed we've got a SBTI session coming up shortly.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So next, thank you, Cam. Yeah, next Wednesday we'll have a couple of webinars with Science Based Targets Initiative on their specific net zero standard. So we'll be talking about beyond value chain mitigation. So what previously might have been seen as offsets, and how companies can set net zero targets as well as science-based targets. Thanks, Cam. Yeah, sign up.
There's a question that's come through here around, I guess it's a scenario-based question from an anonymous placer. They're working towards completing the COC certification before the end of Q2 this year, so i.e. before the new standards released. They're wondering, do they work towards the current standard or should they work towards the new standard? And my response to that would be it's up to them, and it's probably a decision that only the member of the entity could make. What I would suggest they do, they look at the current standard, they look at the new draft standard, bearing in mind changes are probably unlikely to the draft standard. Then they could do a comparison and go, could we actually go to the draft standard? If the new standard is not out prior to their audit date, well, they have to certify to the existing one, but at least it prepares them to step up to the new standard. So again, I'd mentioned this earlier, that some members are going through this internally, looking at the draft new standards and the current standards and going, you know what, it's not much of a step up. I think we can go for the new standard, even if time-wise, the new standards aren't formally released and they have to certify to the existing standards. They are well prepared for that transition up to the new standards. So it's a discussion and a decision that has to be made internally as to whether they can resource it, whether their timing works out right, or whether those gaps between existing standards and new are too great for them to address in a short period of time. So again, a case-by-case situation there that the member needs to make that decision.
Thanks, Cam. I would hope that the improved clarity on chain of custody guidance attached to that chain of custody standard sells itself to the member, right? In the new standard, we have got rid of internal scrap accounting. We have made simplification and removed redundancy. So I'm hoping the new COC standard and accompanying guidance sells itself to members, even as you are certifying against the existing one. Okay. Definition of ecosystem services, example of regulating services. This is going to be from the top of my head, so excuse me if I get it wrong. Is about how we often see local communities able to regulate or have systems in place, social, economic systems, which support the ongoing ability of the ecosystem to deliver its services. So that's kind of indigenous management of forests, for instance, or of fish stocks, for instance. So this is this idea of the human ecosystem interaction. This idea that the nature portion is not divorced from human activity. So those ecosystem services both underpin economies and societies, and the actions of societies through economies impacts the ecosystem. So that dynamic interaction, I think, is where we're getting to with ecosystem services, and that's that regulation services. It's not specifically around formalized regulation, it's about the social regulation of the ecosystem.
Yeah, one example I was going to throw up, Chris, was an environmental flow, for example, down a river course, water course. Because the question was asking for an example, so I had that to add.
Thank you. Winfried, look, I'm not ignoring you, mate. We'll first of all 2.5, 2.6. Note that this is from the performance standard, the environmental and social impact assessments and human rights impact assessments. First thing to say, they're both new criteria since the 2017 version. They only apply to facilities with new projects or major changes to existing facilities. And as a side note, definition of new projects or major changes has been made. So you'll find a definition of new projects and major changes in the updated glossary. So the application applies to those facilities with new projects and major changes, and they give a requirement that those entities need to conduct environmental and social impact assessments and human rights impact assessments, considering baseline conditions from historic aluminium operations. So what was there previously and how do these new projects or major changes impact those baseline conditions? And having conducted an impact assessment is then to develop a management plan around environmental, social and human rights to mitigate identified risks with, as I say, these kind of common themes of regular review, implementation of improvements, reviews every 5 years, and public disclosure of impact assessment as well. So this transparency in information on the back of the impact assessment is clear, but as I say, it's only for new projects or major changes. So that's the changes that have happened under 2.5 and 2.6. Winfried, your second question is related to that, right? I can see it coming now. Those impact assessments required for all entities. How do SMEs address that? You know, how do they shoulder the burden of impact assessment around environmental and social and human rights, and indeed on greenhouse gas independent verification? And here I would say the greenhouse gas data, when we're talking about greenhouse gases, we're talking about the inflow of material as well. And those SMEs are often at the end of the chain, right? They're downstream producers who are consuming metal, which is embodied in their scope 3 emissions, scope 3 category 1, under their material inputs. This, I think, is related to the chain of custody optional data, right? Getting hold of that information from your supplier, your tier 1 supplier, and tier 2 and tier 3 necessarily means a flow of information along that chain. So SMEs at the end will need access to some of that information in order to disclose the footprint of their products. So there is an onus on everyone along the chain to get that data to them. And then, of course, 5.3 says you need to have that independently verified. Right? So you have to have that independently verified before you publish it. It is a cost. It is a time-consuming process. It is an expectation of the standard that certifying entities will do that. I mean, I can't go any, it is going to be a cost, it is going to be a burden. The 1.5 degree future will require that happens. In order for us to understand those flows, you will have to independently verify and release. What we are saying, though, is that not all emissions data everywhere has to be independently verified. It's specific disclosure of emissions data for specific purposes where independent verification happens prior to publication. So yes, we will expect people to be incorporating their scope 3 numbers and to independently verify that. That's part of ASI's raison d'etre, independent verification, that red line. May not be the answer you want to hear, but
just further to that, Chris, though, I understand the guidance does provide a little bit of context too around that with respect to, I guess, the level of effort of independent verification versus the size
absolutely
of the facility. We're not expecting SMEs to, you know, get a gigantic multinational accounting firm and spend €50,000 doing it.
Absolutely. And do you know what, Cam? That's a great point about effort broadly across the standard, right? And it came through in previous consultation rounds as well around SMEs, is that, you know, we have a standard or standards here that apply to all entities, and in the future, actually, as we integrate new supply chain activities into those, even more entities. It applies to all equally, but that level of effort we understand will be different depending on where you sit in the chain. The level of documentation linked to risk, the evidence that will need to be provided. So that's a great point, Cam, and it's throughout the standard. It's not just on greenhouse gases, it's about this level of effort required, and I hope better articulated in these updated documents, including the guidance. Wow, we've done the hour. I think we have loads of questions coming in now. We don't have time to address those. There's a couple of things. One, we can take some of those on in our webinar later this afternoon, but also we encourage people to get in touch with us directly, and also using the feedback, and maybe a quick piece on how you can do that. You can make a submission by email using the comment form that is available on the ASI website in English, in French, in Chinese, but we accept comments in any language. Please feel free to contact us at the Secretariat to arrange a time to speak directly with one of us, me, Cam, one of the other staff. We have a lot more time till the end of the consultation period, and maybe to reiterate in response to Mr. Dong's question, we would accept, or we would certainly be receiving comments after that deadline, but I can't guarantee that they would be incorporated into this next revision period. So 6th of February, get your comments to us in the Secretariat. Keep an eye out for updates to our regular newsletter and communication channels. I hope that the next round of documents, or I expect the next round of documents that are produced are the finalized documents in May in English, French, and Chinese, with other languages forthcoming in June or July of this year. Please use the Q&A to ask questions, but I'll ask this one now as it is in front of me, and it's for you, Cam. It's whether in the assurance manual is there guidance on how to submit audit plans in advance of the audit to ASI?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Penny, for your question. Yes, it is referenced in the new assurance manual guide. It doesn't go into any great length, and don't quote me on this, I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less just email the Secretariat, and I believe an email address is listed. If not, we want it to be a fairly informal and personal process. And look, we've had a number of plans come through to us already. They are just emailed to us. They're emailed to myself or a colleague of mine, and it eventually gets through to us, and the assurance function then review the audit plan with the auditors. And I've had a couple of teleconferences and phone calls and emails with some of those audits already, and the process has worked well. So it's a fairly, I wouldn't say casual, but it's a fairly personal process where auditors just email plans to us well before time, 6 to 8 weeks ideally, so we can give feedback in time for any changes to be made to that plan. Following on from that, actually, Chris, there's a question's come through, and it's a little bit related. It's certainly related to the assurance manual, but the question was, when will the audit reporting platform be changed to the new changes? So I interpret the comment about audit reporting platform being the assurance manual. And it is a good question, and it's one that I can't give a completely black and white answer to. And the reason is because we do have this transition period of 12 months between the old standards and the new standards. And in that 12-month transition period, which at this stage will be more or less May 22 through to May 23, as the transition from the old standards to the new standards happen, there'll also be a transition stage for the assurance manual. So one suggestion I do have, and I mentioned this in the session earlier today, was the new assurance manual. And as I've said in this session, that there's a lot of improvements around clarity and guidance. By all means, I'd be encouraging auditors to look at both documents, because in the early part of the transition phase, they most likely will be still auditing on the current standards, so therefore the current assurance manual will apply. However, the new assurance manual is a better document. There's better clarity, it's better worded, a little bit of the repetition has been removed, and so forth. In terms of those new requirements in the assurance manual, it's our intent to be as pragmatic and realistic as possible as well too. So we will look at some of those new requirements and see if they have or have not been applied to the audits. Generally speaking, if the audits are for the new standards, the new assurance manual will apply. For the old or pre-existing standards, the existing assurance manual will also apply. So they're sort of complementary. So that's the best way I can explain that. But as of we get to say May 2023, we won't have that transition phase, and there's a full transition across to the new assurance manual. So we've got a little bit of a grey time, a little bit of overlap time over that 12-month period.
Thanks very much, Cam. Thank you. I'm going to take give you a bit of space now on assurance. Question come in from Kenji Nosa on GHG emissions data independent verification. What does that mean? That's actually defined in the guidance document, that independent verification, that assurance process, should be undertaken by a verifier independent of the member who's able to publish an objective and impartial assessment. So indeed, as you say, Kenji, verified by a disinterested party, a third party outside the company who is able to provide written statements on that's publicly available, summarizing the verification process. I think we're saying their auditor, right? So yes, third party, independent, disinterested party outside of the company itself for verification. The question came in this morning, more comment than a question, I guess, which is around the fact that the that's going to be challenging, of course, for some small and medium enterprises compared to others. And what do we have to say about the burden of that independent verification? And Cam gave a great answer this morning, and it's articulated well in the guidance, actually throughout the guidance documents, that the level of effort required by that verifier will vary depending on the kind of entity that is under study. And so we're not expecting the same sorts of effort being put in for a multinational as for a small medium enterprise remelter, refiner, let's say, or small refining company. So actually that weight of burden is differential depending on the type of entity under study.
Sorry, Chris, I'll chime in here. There's a couple of related questions to what I last talked about in terms of the assurance manual of the new assurance framework. So with respect to Elemental, which is the online audit reporting capture and framework process, that will also come online, and those changes will come online at the same time. So we've got our Elemental team already working on this, where we will have essentially 4 standards going. If you can understand what I mean, everybody, is that we've got 2 standards at the moment, but for a while, Elemental will have 4 standards, essentially the 2 versions, 2 by 2, the 2 versions of each standard as we go through that transition phase. So there'll be that option up front for auditors and members when they're doing their self-assessment to select what version of the standards you will, and then the relevant criteria in terms of rewording, renumbering, and so forth, that will change accordingly. So there is a fair bit of work for us to do behind the scenes between now and the start of May, but that work's happening already as well. And there's other little changes. There's a comment made here about auto saving and so forth. We've recently upgraded to our platform known as NAC has been recently upgraded, and also the efficiencies. We've now got a dedicated server, dedicated hotline with the software company in the United States. So that's really going to help us to do a lot more tweaking and fine tuning and improvement of the Elemental platform. So that work's already started and will continue to happen as we move across to these new standards. Another comment around the transition phase in terms of when an audit can be done to the new standard and when the old standards are no longer relevant. That's a little clearer to answer, and essentially is that 12-month period. So and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I guess from May 2023, auditing to the old standards is no longer available, and auditing to the new standards cannot certainly happen until the new standards have been released, which in theory at this stage is the end of April.
That's right. There is I'll be a little bit fuzzy here because that adoption date is not yet fully defined. We are planning to have the new versions adopted by our board. That's essentially an approval process on the 27th of April 2022. And the standards themselves, you'll read it in the standards, it says that there is then that 1-year transition period kicks in from that date for 12 months from that date. And so from the 27th or 28th of April 2022, that's a 12-month period where you have the choice between the two. And then on the 27th of April 2023 onwards, only the new version would be audited against. But because that board meeting hasn't yet been fully defined, I can't say for definite it's going to be the 1st of May or the 1st of June or the 27th of April, but we're hoping that that's going to be the date, 27th of April 2022 through to the 27th of April 2023. You'll see it right now. There's some yellow text. If you look at the standards and the guidance documents, there's a bit of yellow text at the beginning that has some square brackets that says populate date here. They will be populated in the final standard when the date of adoption is known.
Yeah, and I think the key, just to reiterate Chris's point about choice, yes, there is this 12-month period that we do have where there is that option to choose, and I've had some discussions with members already, and they're actually having that discussion themselves in-house. Do we stick with the status quo for another sort of certification cycle, or do we go up to the new standards straight away? And we've got some larger members ready for recertification, you know, sort of the second half of 2022, and they're having that discussion. They're comparing, they're quite literally putting the two standards up on the screen and comparing the changes and saying, are we ready? So that's a discussion that members and entities need to have amongst themselves about whether they're ready to commit to the new standard immediately, or whether they do wait that 12-month period.
Thanks, Cam. It's a great question. I've left this one till last, right? Because I would say it goes beyond this current revision period, but it's an interesting one for post revision. The question is, why is the COC standard not obligatory? The impact would be far bigger. Well, my question to this questioner is would it? That's the first thing. We're seeing in the COC pool now, actually, really the driver, I think, in the next couple of years we'll see for sustainability impact may be more capital markets than the market for the product. So less of a pull from customers for responsibly sourced material, and more of a push from lenders for companies to have certified schemes in place in order to access capital for decarbonisation. So this is actually an interesting thing that we're looking at right now post-revision, is what are the drivers of change? We didn't make COC obligatory because in this early days, we're trying to encourage uptake. And it's not just about the provision of responsibly sourced material, it's also about the development of a responsibly supplying industry and a sustainable industry as a whole. So in those early days, we didn't say COC mandatory, we said COC is optional, but you need performance standard underpinning that. You can't get COC without performance standard. But as we grow, that may change. So this anonymous attendee who's asked this question, the answer right now is that we don't have for definite an idea that it will drive change, and we're very early on in our life cycle, I guess. But that's not to say this question is off the table. So this is a great question, I think, for post-consultation, or sorry, post-revision. And indeed, post-revision is when we will start to think about the next revision period in 5 years' time. And one of the ways into that is the fact that we're going to have much more regular guidance updates. Instead of every 3 to 5 years, we'll be having regular defined guidance updates as we go along, which will then feed into future criterion changes. So if you I stay with us in ASI, keep having these conversations, because this is the kind of areas that we'll be looking at for whole scale change in the future as the ESG landscape changes. Just one final question. Does an entity have to be a single location, or can it consider all locations on a whole? Both. You can have either of those. So it can either be one facility or it can be multiple. The certification scope is up to the entity itself. Maybe with that, Cam, unless you have any final comments or words on assurance before we close?
No, look, no, I don't, Chris. And I think, yeah, your response to the last question was spot on. Yep, a single site. What we've also found too is that members have often done one site and then done what's known as a scope change audit, where they've added some extra sites in, and they've done some more, and then done some more. So they've just grown their scope over the time, and then their COC typically follows like a shadow. So as their performance standard scope grows, as their systems and processes mature, from a sustainability and governance point of view, the COC scope has grown to follow it as well too. So that's probably the approach I would be recommending, is doing that approach.
That's a great point, Cam. And for those who are kind of considering doing that, I would encourage use of the new standard rather than the old one in the transition period, because otherwise then you're going to have to grow your scope as you align with the different versions. So my advice would be go with a new one. So with that, thank you all very much for your great questions. As I say, the team within ASI are available over the next few months and the next month and beyond to answer any further questions you have. Keep an eye on the ASI website, and please do get your feedback to us in plenty of time so that we can begin to consider that towards April adoption. And I look forward to presenting in April, May, those final versions of both the standards and the guidance documents. Thanks very much to the ASI team for the support today on the webinar, and thank you as well, Cam, for being my partner today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, folks. Bye.